Thanks very much. And indeed, Munich is the secret capital of Germany. that is a fact. But thanks for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to discuss the JCPOA implementation, also its challenges, and our wider relationship with Iran. I am in excellent company with distinguished researchers, former colleagues, and of course my illustrious predecessor as Secretary General, Pierre Vimont. Around 2 years ago, same time, I was practically closed in the Coburg Hotel in Vienna. I'm still very grateful to the Austrians for their very generous hospitality. They provided really the perfect setup for the negotiations, but we were basically living in the Coburg, negotiating till early hours in the morning. Stefan Clement is here, who is our lead expert. We were trying to conclude the nuclear negotiations with Iran. You may recall that we had reached an agreement on the parameters in Lausanne at in early April of the same year. It was quite a busy, I have to say nerve-wracking period. I'm not a marathon runner, but of course everyone who's ever run a marathon tells me it's the last yards of a marathon that are always the most difficult. And I think if I look back when we started at the time, there were probably few who predicted we could reach a deal, and probably even fewer who thought that, who anticipated that the deal would actually hold. We have proven the critics wrong. A deal was concluded, and so far it has been implemented, and it is absolutely delivering on its objectives. This is for me, the most important, the key issue. After more than a year since implementation day of the JCPOA, we are now in a position to see the first results. On the nuclear side, Iran's nuclear program was rolled back. It was placed under very tight inspections. The IAEA has repeatedly confirmed, actually 5 times already in the regular reports they do, that Iran is abiding by its commitments. On the other side, and this was a consequence of sanctions lifting, we are witnessing improvements in Iran's microeconomic performance and strong growth in the EU-Iran trade and foreign direct investment. I'll come to that with more details later. But in general, I can also say that contacts between the EU and Iran, which started basically as a trickle, have rapidly swollen into a steady stream. But maybe allow me to say a couple of words on the JCPOA first, because this is more than just a nuclear agreement. This is now an integral part of the global non-proliferation agenda. It's a stabilizing factor in the regional international security architecture, and many have said and many have written after the deal that it was a great achievement for diplomacy. I don't want to say that, I'm obviously biased having been involved, but it's a multilateral deal which was endorsed by the UN Security Council, and as such it now belongs to the international community. These principles were recalled by the EU Foreign Affairs Council, most recently in November, and they are repeated in many, many occasions by the High Representative herself. For example, when we celebrated the first anniversary of the JCPOA earlier in January. Also, Federica Mogherini spoke at the Carnegie event recently in March in Washington, and she also referred to it in her recent address to the Security Council. We have had an important facilitating role during the negotiations, also as the text negotiators in the final months. But now in the implementation phase, on behalf of the High Representative, I continue to chair the Joint Commission meetings. The Joint Commission is the 6 countries plus Iran, and the task of the Joint Commission is to oversee, monitor implementation of the JCPOA. This is both the sanctions part and the nuclear part. In addition, the External Action Service is chairing a number of working groups that have been established under the Joint Commission, and they are designed to facilitate implementation of the deal. I'm referring to that because sometimes there is the impression that work stopped with the conclusion of the agreement. This is obviously not the case. I have had the privilege to be involved from the start of the negotiations and continue to be involved. But if you look back, if you have particularly if you take a closer look now at the JCPOA, particularly also the 5 annexes, there's the main text, there are the 5 annexes, you realize the complexity and the wide scope of the agreement, but also the challenges ahead of the next years. And this is the next point I would like to come to. What exactly are the challenges? But maybe first to say, implementation is on track. As said before, with the most recent quarterly report of the IEA, which came out in February, which confirmed once again that Iran was complying with its nuclear commitments. It is early stages, and we expect a full and effective implementation throughout the lifetime of the deal. I firmly believe it's a robust deal, it's a good deal, it's a solid deal, but this solidity and robustness needs to stand the test of implementation. This is why it's a long-term task, and this is why also long-term vigilance will be needed. Over the past year, we have had some minor issues, but they were observed by the IEA. There were corrective measures that were applied immediately. I'm mentioning that because we are absolutely transparent about this. There is no secrecy about this. And it proves also that monitoring mechanisms are working, and also, of course, you gain experience also while you are implementing, and there is always room then to further fine-tune the detailed parameters of implementation. One point I would like to make, which is very important and where the EU has been particularly engaged, this is Annex 3, Civil Nuclear Cooperation, in particular in the area of nuclear safety. We have been from the beginning promoting nuclear security, nuclear safety, because if implemented fully, this will significantly contribute to the development of a modern civilian nuclear program, and it will allow Iranian nuclear scientists to reintegrate into the international civil nuclear community and to cooperate internationally. And I think it's quite clear that this is of mutual benefit. As far as the Europeans and US is concerned, we have fulfilled our part of the agreement as far as lifting of sanctions is concerned. There's, of course, much debate in Iran about the economic benefits. A part of this debate is self-imposed, as probably expectations were very high, but there is definitely a positive trend. And that's why I just want maybe to give you some examples. Trade between the EU and Iran grew 79% in 2016 by comparison with 2015. Foreign direct investment reached $12 billion in the same period. Oil revenues have returned to pre-sanction levels. Oil debts are being recovered. The GDP has grown sharply, and investment in infrastructure has resumed, and there are quite a lot of very known international companies, be it Airbus, Boeing, European companies, Peugeot, Siemens, others, who are engaging. This is, of course, not to deny that growth has been uneven in some areas. Definitely, we need more progress in the banking sector. Banks, probably as a general remark I can make, they remain reluctant, over-compliant in some cases. But even there are positive trends. SWIFT has now reconnected to most banks, and there are many correspondent banking relationships which have been re-established with Iranian banks. But this is also an issue we discuss very clearly with our Iranian counterparts. Iran needs to do its part. They need to address the need to modernize the banking sector, and also there's the need to comply with the FATF requirements. This is all the requirements related to financing, countering terrorist financing and money laundering. But overall, this allows me to say, once again, the JCPOA is working and it's delivering on its objectives. So I'll come finally to the challenges now. What are the challenges we are facing? I would say the risks are mainly political. Both in the US and in Iran, the deal has had its detractors and opponents. The fact that critical voices were reinforced with the US elections, this is a factor. We definitely need to wait now for the outcome of the presidential elections in Iran. But I was following this very closely. All the 6 presidential candidates in the Iranian election campaign have actually promised to stick to the agreement, and I think this is quite significant. There's another risk, which is more of a regional, international dimension. It's no secret that, of course, we still have differences with Iran on a number of areas. There's the missile program, support to non-state actors, involvement in regional conflicts. But let me clear, all these issues are outside the scope of the agreement. And this is, and I really would like to underline this because there is a lot of confusion on this sometimes, is the JCPOA is only and exclusively about nuclear issue. It was never meant to address other issues of concerns, definitely not regional issues. We did not have this mandate, and frankly, had we had the mandate, I don't think it would have worked. As important as these issues are, and we address them, but this is not part of the agreement. But still, I think we need to work to resolve these factors for the sake, not only for the sake of regional security, but also to avoid any other possible spillovers to the agreement. And the one issue that I also raise constantly is the need to rebuild trust and confidence. We've managed to rebuild trust and confidence during long years of negotiations, but there's, of course, a clear need to rebuild trust and confidence in the region, which, of course, will also promote a more favorable investors' climate. There have been questions raised by the ongoing review of US policy on Iran, including the JCPOA. The European Union has come out repeatedly at all levels, all occasions, in support of preserving the achievements of the deal. We will continue to do so. And because I cannot think of any scenario where we would be better off if the agreement would be rescinded. The continued full implementation of the agreement is the basis upon which the European Union has been rebuilding our engagement with Iran across a wide range of areas. You may recall that Federica Mogherini visited Tehran last year with a number of commissioners. A joint statement was issued afterwards with Foreign Minister Zarif, which is basically the basis for a gradual development of our bilateral relations. And the range of issues where we are already cooperating on is actually rather broad. It goes from trade to transport, energy to environment, migration to fight against drug trafficking, human rights, humanitarian assistance. Not many people know that Iran is hosting 3 million Afghan refugees, so we are stepping up our humanitarian assistance to support Iran in coping with these issues. I've already mentioned bilateral trade. Our Commissioner Cañete was in Tehran recently to start an energy dialogue. He hosted an energy forum and a climate change conference, so we have every interest. And this is also one of the issues right from the beginning where there was a clear interest on the Iranian side to work with us on environmental issues, something we were all too ready to respond to because environmental issues are across border, disasters don't stop at the border, and to try and promote Iran in tackling with these challenges is also confidence building per se from the regional perspective. Another area maybe I should mention where we are supporting Iran and is the accession to the WTO. Now, this is not a gift to Iran, but we feel this is a very important common objective, very much in the context of our interest in promoting market economy rules. We will continue this policy of what I would call gradual engagement, which will be cooperative in the areas where we have mutual interest, but also critical in the areas where we disagree. You know that we have sanctions in place when it comes to human rights violations. We have an arms embargo in place and sanctions related to sponsoring of terrorism. In conclusion, let me say that the JCPOA is the best peaceful option I think the international community has to ensure that Iran's nuclear program continues to serve exclusively peaceful purposes. Full and effective implementation by all will be fundamental, both in terms of preserving the agreement, but also to further develop the EU-Iran bilateral relationship. This means that Iran needs to keep abiding to the terms of the deal. They need to keep delivering on the nuclear commitments. In times of uncertainty, flawless implementation is definitely the best insurance against the critics of the agreement. But also sanctions lifting will need to continue as agreed. For this, the role of European investors, business, will be absolutely critical. All participants in the JCPOA will need to work together to ensure that the right conditions exist. And on the Iranian side, as I mentioned before, it's quite important to continue addressing the banking, microeconomic reform issues and efforts to give comfort and encouragement to economic operators. At the same time, issues such as Iran's ballistic missile programs, its regional policies, they are outside the scope of the agreement, as said before, but they will definitely don't serve the purpose of promoting confidence and trust. This is why we will also continue to raise them in our bilateral context, because trust and confidence is as crucial as ever, particularly in this part of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Schmid. Thank you for this, this keynote. You have graciously agreed to take a number of questions. So if I can invite you to sit down.
Here?
Yeah, why not? You get the microphone here. I'll get to sit here. Even though you touched upon these issues, the upcoming elections, the developments in Washington, we will leave these to the panel discussion, which is following in due course. Because I was intrigued by a number of things that have more to do with the EU-Iran relations, and you mentioned trust a number of times, and how important it is. And I can only, get to understand how much trust was needed for you as a negotiator and for the negotiating team. But how does this spread in these broader relations that the EU is now developing with Iran? How have EU-Iran relations developed since the deal so that they can support the implementation of the JCPOA more widely?
Actually, I mean, the deal reopened the possibility for the European Union to engage. I mean, during the period of sanctions, basically there were no bilateral relations. I mean, whenever we met the Iranian delegation, this was only and exclusively about the nuclear issues, about the nuclear negotiations. We have defined our approach as gradual engagement or re-engagement. This is why I think I was referring to Federica Mogherini's visit last year, where she took a number also of commissioners from the European Commission. If I remember, I think she said in the press conference at the time, she said, our relationship is based on the 4 C's. It's comprehensive in scope, and indeed this is why I gave some examples. We really wanted to focus, and this was also an Iranian interest, on issues that are of a mutual interest. This is, of course, climate change, environmental issues, also promoting students. Iranian students have access to Erasmus+. I mentioned the refugees Iran is hosting, I think, where we have every interest in supporting them further. But also issues such as human rights, they are raised also as part of the dialogue we have established, so comprehensive, at the same time critical. There are areas where we continue to disagree, but then always constructive in tone, and then cooperative. This is particularly goes for the many areas where we have joint and common interests. We also discussed regional issues in the dialogues we have established. Everything from Syria, Afghanistan, there's really no taboo, and this probably was not possible beforehand. I think this is important because it shows that international cooperation indeed pays off, and the possibility to engage now has been beneficial in some areas already, while, as I said, at the same time, there are critical issues that remain, and they are very openly addressed.
Okay, and well, sticking with the JCPOA for just one more question. As much as it's an unrecognized or little recognized success of the Europeans to have shepherded this deal together with the member states, the Americans, Chinese, and Russians, but it's still, I mean, and as you described, it's a success. To what extent is this something that could be replicated? Does the Iran deal and the success to the present, does that make the EU a born mediator for other crises, or what is the format like that it would have to be so that the EU could follow on other issues?
There's of course no one-size-fits-all solution, but definitely, and I'm absolutely convinced of this, only the European Union could play that role. No other actor would have been accepted. Russia could not have done it, China could have not done it, the US could not have done it, but also none of the European countries could have done it. It was only the EU that was accepted because the EU was perceived by both sides actually as a neutral actor, as a moderator, a facilitator. We were a bridge builder, also in the context between Iran and US, which of course continued to be difficult. They were difficult before, so we have this very important role as a bridge builder. It's too little known. I mean, Pierre knows it, of course. The External Action Service, the EU, is involved in many conflict prevention situations around the world. This is something we cannot share too openly sometimes, because when you're involved in mediation, conflict prevention, facilitation, this is by nature more secret. Many of our heads of delegations have been involved in many conflicts around the world and have played a very important facilitating role. Iran is one of the most prominent examples. There are others, Federica Mogherini's role, Cathy Ashton before, when it comes to the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. So I think the EU's role indeed has been crucial, but there's another important element, that's the format. The format was crucial. It started as an EU3 project in 2003. And it's also important to remember, some call it P5+1. That's also historically not correct. It's not the P5 that started it, it's the E3 in 2003. I happened to be chief of staff of the then German foreign minister, so I was there when we did the first visit to Tehran in October 2003, when the whole process was launched. We enlarged it then, and Russia came in, US came in, and China came in. And I think this was quite important because this group more or less represented the spectrum of the international community. And let me say that, let me pay tribute to everyone, but also particularly to Russia and China, because I've been asked very often, I mean, how did it work? Everyone knows that our relationship with Russia has had its ups and downs. We have sanctions in place when it comes to the situation in Eastern Ukraine, Crimea. We have always worked in a very, very constructive way in this format. Russia has been an essential partner. They have contributed to the implementation, so has China. They are doing the modernization of the Iraq heavy water reactor, which is a key issue of the agreement. And I think this is why it's so important. This shows that indeed multilateral diplomacy works. You have to give it a chance, and it works. And we have had the success of the agreement has been also very much depending on the unity of this group. This has been another key issue. So to come back to your question, I mean, you can't just transform the 3+3 format to any other context, but I would say you need definitely a facilitator that is respected by everyone, and I think this is the EU, and that definitely can be replicated for other situations. And then you need to ensure the support of the international community. So this is why during the whole negotiations, even if it was only the 6 countries that were a part of this, I always ensured regular outreach to key countries. I just see the Azeri ambassador sitting in front of me. He was one of those who I kept briefed regularly, of course, the GCC countries. I never shared details of the negotiations. This would not have been appropriate, but I tried to give them a heads up in terms of where we are going, also to ensure their support. And maybe last point on this one is also it shows that sanctions alone never work. They were important, but you have to create incentives, the right incentives. You have to give the right mix. If you don't put incentives in place, then things don't work either. So the use dual track approach, I think, has also been fundamental. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm receiving signs that your time with us is up. You have a meeting to run to, but let me say once again, we're honored that you've made it here. Thank you very much for addressing the audience, and thank you very much for your insights. Good luck, that's all I can say, because there is a lot of work still ahead of you. Thank you, Helga Schmid.
Thank you for having me.
Us today at the Carnegie Endowment, Carnegie Europe. It's lovely to have a chance to follow up on that conversation that was just happening with Ms. Schmid and Cornelius Adebahr. But the only person who didn't introduce himself properly is you. You introduced us all. I'm going to introduce everyone again, once again, just to be sure. But let me introduce Cornelius Adebahr to you as well, if you don't know him already. He's a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Europe. His research focuses on European foreign policy in a broad sense, and in Iran, EU policy in a very specific sense. In fact, he has a book which has just come out, and it's called Europe and Iran, the Nuclear Deal and Beyond. It offers a comprehensive and a compelling account of how this is, as he says, the EU negotiations and the policy towards Iran is a success, or the biggest success to date, of the European Union, in which it explains the approach to Iran, which led to the agreement, the JCPOA that we were just talking about, or the nuclear deal, how it happened. And he also explains how this pivotal role of Europe is, as he says, I'm a journalist, so I have to be unbiased, as he says, is underappreciated by many in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere in the world, policymakers and analysts. We will have a look at the details of the book later, but I want to start by asking you some questions about that. Jarrett Blanc and Pierre Vimont have been introduced as well. You have them in the notes as well. But thank you for both of you for joining us also. As I just mentioned, in the book, you say the way the negotiations happened with Iran, and whether you call it E3+3 or P5+1, the rest of the negotiators, was the biggest success of the European Union in terms of foreign policy. What are the factors that make you say that?
Well, I guess the most important factor is that there is something like the JCPOA. If you look at how the EU efforts to negotiate with Iran and together with the international community from 2006 onwards, how they were received over the years, there's been lots of criticism up until probably 2015. So the success is obviously, it's manifest in the deal and in the fact that it keeps being implemented until the very day today. So in that sense, of course, with hindsight, it's easy to call it a success. But there is more to it than just being smart after the fact. You can trace the Europeans' approach, and Helga Schmid mentioned the E3 starting out at the very beginning. You can trace this approach throughout these negotiations, the dual-track approach, the idea that, well, diplomacy is close to the heart of the Europeans, so they were always pushing for diplomacy. Sanctions was a little bit more difficult. That's where the Americans came in and other allies who said, but you also have to do sanctions. But the balance between the two, getting the balance right, was always, or had been a priority for the Europeans. And this was what ultimately carried the negotiations to the deal. And so in that sense, it is a true success, not only because it happened, but because it happened in a way that the Europeans wanted it to happen.
And you mentioned with Ms. Schmid on continuing this way ahead. gradual engagement, as she mentioned specifically. How do you think, based on these lessons that we have learned, which I guess if we read your book, we will know more about, how can this go ahead? How can this go forward from now?
I think the approach to reaching the JCPOA is one thing, because that's the negotiated approach. That's the compartmentalized approach, as was also said before. It was focusing only on one issue, trying to disregard against all odds, disregard other issues, so that one could solve this one issue of the nuclear tensions or the tensions around Iran's nuclear program. This approach is no longer valid, and it's not even, I mean, it's not possible, but it's also not valid, because that's not what is on the table right now. Now it's this broadening of engagement based on this one agreement that one has, the cooperation in the nuclear deal, including civilian nuclear cooperation. But it's the idea that the deal can't hold only by itself. It's a very thin connection that it has been established between the 6 negotiation partners and Iran. So ideally, each negotiation partner would try to broaden this. And the Europeans, as we have heard, are ready to do this. They have been engaging already. For the United States, it's very improbable that they will very soon broaden this kind of engagement, but at least there we need to maintain this level of commitment and cooperation. So we are definitely in a different mindset. It's not negotiation mode anymore. It's cooperation, but it's also necessary to engage in this cooperation in order to preserve what has been achieved.
Speaking of preserving what has been achieved, Jarrett, you were in the coordination group, or lead of the coordination group, overseeing the implementation of JCPOA in the US side of things. What is it, or how different is it, as Cornelius mentions, the European way of negotiating and the US way, and I assume the Iran way, putting them together?
Well, you know, I guess I probably am reluctant to speak in a sort of cultural way to differences between US negotiators, European negotiators, Iranian negotiators. I actually think that we're linked by more than divides us. Good negotiators try to find solutions to problems. And I would really echo and subscribe to the point that both Helga and Cornelius have made about the sort of the unique role that the European Union was able to play in the JCPOA negotiations, a role that might be replicable in other areas. Not because there's something sort of unique about how a European negotiator approaches the problem, but because the European Union, as this quasi-international organization, quasi-state organization, that has, you know, a fair degree of confidence, that has a lot to bring to the table in terms of sort of the potential for diplomatic engagement, the potential for economic engagement, and that is also able to sort of tactically coordinate multiple actors at the table, right? So that's able to play a role in sort of bringing a particular kind of German expertise, a particular kind of British view at the right time and in the right way. I do think that it used skillfully, and it was in the case of the JCPOA, the European Union is able to be very, very effective in that regard.
In a recent article, Cornelius, you mentioned, it reminds me of this, the delicate triangle, or a delicate structure of EU-Iran on one side, US-Iran on one side, and EU-US on the other side. And you said this is now in need of rebalancing, or making sure that the structure stays steady. How can we do that? And how do you mean by that delicate rebalancing?
Well, the delicate rebalancing the rebalancing has to take place. What unbalanced this triangle was the US election in last November, where the candidate that won had promised to rip the deal on day one. So everyone was in for a shock that night, but then there were expectations November, December. No one knew what would actually happen and whether the deal would still be alive today in May. So that's where an unforeseen danger to this triangular relationship had come from. What has happened since then is that countless delegations of European policymakers, EU policymakers, member states, they traveled to Washington to say how important the deal is to the Europeans. And not just the Europeans, but to the non-proliferation regime, more broadly speaking, and that there is simply no alternative to it. And we're still sitting here and we're talking about a deal that is in place, so nothing happened on day one, nothing bad happened on day two in this regard, and 3 and 4 and so on. This may have borne some fruit, that the Europeans really put their weight behind it and said, this is important to us, don't touch it. And frankly, this needs to continue, not only with the White House, but with the Hill, with senators and congressmen as much as they are involved. This is, I was in Washington, I should say this, until last summer, and I could see during the review period that the United States, the government and the Congress had after the signing of the deal, where the European ambassadors got engaged. And they suddenly had to do outreach on the Hill, which was new to them, because ambassadors are also used to deal with government officials. So their normal business would be mostly with the White House and the National Security Council. And that has changed. That changed at that moment where they realized, no, we have also to talk to all these representatives and these senators. So that will have to continue, making a point to the US side, and at the same time to the Iranian side, how certain activities can be easily misconstrued in Washington, putting the Europeans then back in a hot seat where they have to try to explain to one side, this doesn't really mean what the other side was saying, or this isn't really as bad as you think it is. So the mediation continues in a way.
Speaking of European ambassadors and their role in mediation, as we mentioned, there is a new administration in the US. There will be a new administration, or maybe pretty much the same administration in Iran. We'll find out in a few days. And there's a new administration in France as well. The Macron government is expected to announce its cabinet any second right now, today. How do you see these new administrations working together and continuing on that road of engagement and negotiation with Iran?
It's a very interesting question, because listening to what Cornelius was saying and remembering very well what happened in 2003, neither of the three sides of the triangle Cornelius was talking about in 2003 was there. And you have to understand that this whole process started out of the American intervention. It's the child of the American intervention. It has been seen like that by the three foreign ministers from Europe, very much like that at the time. It was a way of finding a new cohesion between Britain, Germany and France, who were totally split on the whole issue of the Iraqi intervention, and they thought it could be a nice way of doing this. Secondly, it was trying to find a solution to what appeared as a major danger for the world ahead if Iran went ahead with its nuclear arms. But thirdly, and people tend to forget that, it was also looking at the fallouts of this US intervention and the risk for the whole security in the region, which we are witnessing very much today. So the fact that these three ministers started to work on this, went to Tehran, you had all this in this process, in this way of dealing with it. I was reminding Cornelius at the time, we forgot it since then, but when the EU3 were in charge, they had put among the three baskets that they were working on, one which was dedicated to regional security, which meant that we're not going to try to solve only the nuclear aspect, we're going to look at the other aspects.
May have taken another 10 years to reach that agreement.
You're right.
If ever.
But you see, when we went from 3 to 6, the EU3 plus 3, we left aside that basket. And I think we have lived to regret it to some extent, because as we needed to focus, I now understand very well, we focused more and more on the nuclear issue. We forgot the other side, and we created this vacuum where Iran managed to find its way, and where, of course, Israel, like Saudi Arabia, like the other countries, became more and more worried and concerned about Iran's growing influence. But at the beginning, that was not what we were thinking of. We were precisely looking at this aspect and trying to find also a solution there. So I found it quite telling that we've gone from that to the JCPOA, and we still got the whole challenge of Iran influence still there.
Do you see another round of talks on regional security with
It's
Iran?
a totally different deal from where we were in 2003. In 2003, Iran was not in Iraq. It hadn't gone into Syria as it has. And let's put it that way. Yemen maybe. And in Lebanon, they were starting to support Hezbollah, but it hadn't taken yet the extraordinary importance it has now. So coming back to your first question, yes, of course, we all need to work together, and I think you have a new administration in France that will come out soon, which is very eager to find ways of bringing down the tension. To do it with our European colleagues, to do it with Federica Mogherini, no doubt about this. But here again, may I introduce another observation? When we started in 2003, you had only the 3 foreign ministers. When they came back from Tehran, they discussed and decided it would be good to bring Javier Solana in so that it would become a European affair. When François Hollande and Angela Merkel launched what was called the Normandy format with regard to the Ukrainian crisis and went through negotiating the Minsk agreement, a few diplomats said, why don't you do the same thing and bring Federica Mogherini in? You see the result, she's not in today. So do you call this a loss compared to 10 years ago? I don't know, but it's quite striking.
And you mentioned the incoming French administration. The approach to Iran, many in Iran believe, between the time, for example, when Dominique de Villepin was the foreign minister and Bernard Kouchner was very different. How can individual European countries that are part of this EU corner of the triangle bring together their opinions in a way that they can act as a united front?
I think it's through the European process here in Brussels, Foreign Affairs Council, working groups, contacts with the EES, because of course compared to the time when Dominique de Villepin was there was no JCPOA. We are engaged by the JCPOA and we can do nothing that could in any way undermine what has been done. And I think all member states are very cautious and quite eager to avoid jeopardizing what has been achieved. So I think it is very much about moving together in the best way possible. At the same time, you have strong economic competition between the member states. You know, Iran is a big market, and they're all looking at this with great appetite.
Especially now with the President Trump administration in the US, and maybe at least less slow rapprochement with the US, if at all a rapprochement. Some see the European role right now as one that will benefit from this lack of trade or friendship with the US, and some see Europe in a position of actually being also threatened by this lack of friendship between the US and Iran. How do you think that will work if the negotiations or if the relations between US and Iran doesn't work very well under a future Iranian president and the current US president? Will that be better for Europe or worse?
I think it's exactly the mixed picture you were talking about, and this is what Helga, I think, was pinpointing. It's about many contacts for the time being with the new American administration in order to explain what JCPOA is about, trying to avoid the Trump administration rocking the boat. It's about the waiver. We hear that the waiver may be extended, and that will be a good thing. It's also being careful about the non-nuclear issues, the ones related to the ballistic missile program, to human rights, to the support for terrorism, and therefore the sanctions that could be increased and reinforced on the American side. Because of course, this doesn't go without notice in Tehran, and this may have consequences. At one time, at one moment, you may have people saying this is not in the spirit of what we have settled with the JCPOA, and therefore you could have misunderstanding, misgivings, and at the moment the whole thing could derail. So for the
Some of the presidential campaigners candidates right now are investing on that unhappiness or those questions exactly.
Absolutely, absolutely. On both sides, you can see that. So it's a matter of self-restraint on both sides. And there, I think the EU has a role to play in pushing for this self-restraint and promoting this self-restraint on both sides, Iran as in Washington.
Self-restraint
in Washington? Any advice on that?
It sounds like a terrific idea. If I could go back a moment to an earlier, just an immediately earlier part of the conversation and say that I think that to my mind, the starting point for Europe in its engagement with Iran and its engagement with the United States needs to be, I think, where Helga ended with her bottom line. The JCPOA is working. It's working for the United States and Europe in addressing our concerns about Iran as a nuclear or nuclear threshold state. It's working for Iran. You've got the IMF reporting 7.4% growth in the first 6 months of the last fiscal year. Inflation in the single digits for the first time in 3 decades, which is a problem that's in the bones of the Islamic Republic. These are kitchen table problems for Iran that are being addressed largely because of the success of the JCPOA. You can talk about all the things that the JCPOA didn't do because it is a deal limited to the nuclear program and to the sanctions that were targeted at the nuclear program. But I think it's very easy to overstate that. I think actually that although the JCPOA is about the nuclear program, its implications go well beyond that. So on the regional side, for example, the United States, Europe, we have experience and tools to deal with regional powers, countries that we sometimes see eye to eye with, we sometimes disagree with, countries very much like Iran. We have a much less proven set of tools to deal with nuclear regional powers or nuclear threshold regional powers. So by taking that off the table, the JCPOA actually makes all of the other concerns that are mentioned, whether they're regional or ballistic missiles or anything else, it turns them from, I think, really potentially existential concerns to simply manageable regional concerns. And so that's one thing. A second thing I think that the JCPOA does sort of beyond its 4 corners is that it proves that the sanctions are what they claim to be, that they are not the action of irrevocable hostility, but that if we say a sanction is in place because of the nuclear program, and that problem is resolved, the sanction also is lifted. And so I think that points to why, for example, you're seeing progress in Iran on the FATF, because there is some evidence now that, look, if we make some of these reforms, it is possible for us to reintegrate and address some of the economic issues that are, I think, first and foremost in Iranian voters' minds. And the last thing I would say, is that it goes beyond, the JCPOA has implications beyond the immediate nuclear issue as a simple question of US and European credibility. If we are unable to take yes for an answer, if we are unable to abide by our own commitments, then our ability to deal with really any other problem, whether it's climate change or North Korea or other issues in Iran's region, I mean, Americans love talking about our credibility, and it seems to me that our credibility hinges much more on our ability to stick with this agreement than it does on any particular decision we make on cruise missiles in Syria. All of this leads, I think, to the question that you're getting at, which is, well, what does that, given that the possibility of sort of continued evolutionary progress between the United States and Iran seems to be on ice for now. What does that mean for Europe? And I think what it means for Europe, first and foremost, my plea to Europe, first and foremost, would be focus on the JCPOA. You have an audience in Washington that cares what you think. You have an audience in Tehran that cares what you think, that are looking for explanations about where the other side is and how this all fits together. And I think using that audience, use it to say, let's keep this agreement alive. Let's keep commitment to it. I think that's what provides the platform where a year or 2 years from now, there could maybe be a realistic conversation about some continuing solution to other problems. If the JCPOA falls apart because of US action or because of US response to Iranian action, it will not be commercially good for Europe. So I think that's the the solution here is to protect what is protectable.
Do you think it will be economically not good for Europe as well, or not?
Well, I mean, it's...
I'm saying that because I've heard some saying that this will be fantastic for European countries economically, trade-wise, if they are the only partners who can go into Iran, if the US or the Gulf countries or the Middle East countries don't want to.
Well, that's possible that some people think that way, but I would disagree. I mean, European companies have gone into Iran ever since the deal was signed, and they have held these conversations, and some contracts have been signed, but it's not like as if they were there massively right now and visibly, and that's part of the problem. So, I mean, certainly, if the deal fell apart, and we know that European companies are always still waiting for some kind of action coming from DC, some kind of green light, which never turns green and which is only half yellow. So it would be worse, because then they wouldn't go into Iran. They wouldn't do business with Iran if the US changed course. And that's maybe one of those, because ultimately this is about sanctions, and what Jarrett said about sanctions ultimately being liftable, it is an important sign that it's just a tool. It's not a fixed ideology, the sanction. But on the other hand, it is what still bothers the Iranians, because they say, well, maybe sanctions are lifted on paper, but in reality, they are still there. They are there because banks are still hesitant. They are over-compliant. They are still hesitant. And the other example that you mentioned, and that's a great example, is the Financial Action Task Force, FATF for short, which is a body of the OECD, so it's a rich countries club thing, to establish rules and regulations for the banking sector. And they, to some Iranians, and I was there in March, early March for the last time, they have an effect like you could call it tertiary sanctions. Iranians need to comply with these FATF regulations so that they don't they don't get on the blacklist again, so that there is at least a chance for European and international companies and banks to do business with them. They also want to enter the World Trade Organization. These are voluntary measures that the Iranians are doing, but they are doing it as if they were imposed from the outside, because they don't have a choice. If they want to harvest the fruits of the JCPOA, they have to do these things, and they only find out about this now. They thought if we get rid of the sanctions, then we are free to do whatever we want to do, and now they are realizing no one cheated them on this. It was obvious, one could have known, but they are only realizing now that there is still so much more that we need to do in order to do business. So again, the sanctions remain crucial, and it's important that they were lifted and that they appear to be an instrument, and a rational instrument. But it doesn't stop there. The re-engagement needs to go beyond that.
Allow me to be devil's advocate for a bit, because we don't have any official representative from Iran, and say that there is a climate of unhappiness, dissatisfaction with the progress of the economic openness in Iran, the political openness in Iran, the events or the benefits of the JCPOA per se. And there is this lack of confidence about what's going to happen with the US. This upcoming Friday, I think in 2 days, is the deadline for the US to decide on extending some sanctions.
Today,
separate. Today.
We'll still have a few hours.
Yeah. So there is a lot of fear in Iran over the future of these talks and the benefits of, even if it stays as status quo. If you were to talk to an Iranian official, let's say, or see it through the Iranian eyes, what do you think would be what they need to do at this point to keep their end of the bargain? Shall I start with you, John?
Well, so, first of all, I think that, of course, you're right, that it's no secret that there is political dissatisfaction in Iran. I think that the first thing I would weigh against that political dissatisfaction are the statistics we've already mentioned. 7.6% economic growth in the first 6 months of the fiscal year, inflation in the single digits, IMF projections for year-on-end economic growth of 6.5%. And you have to remember the starting point for all these numbers, right? 2 years ago, Iran had negative growth. It was in a what looked to be a permanent recession.
And over 40%
yeah.
Inflation.
That's right. I mean, so these are huge historical accomplishments in terms of the macroeconomic picture in Iran. Now, is it everything that everyone had hoped for? It obviously is not, and part of that I think has to do with, as Cornelius says, an almost sort of intentional cabining of people's understanding of what some of these the causes of some of these macroeconomic problems, right? So the fact is that Iran, even without the US secondary sanctions applied on the nuclear program, remains a difficult place to do business. There's a lot of financial intransparency. There is, and Iran, like other difficult places to do business, is sort of having to find ways to struggle through that, right? It's not just Iran. There are a bunch of countries in the world where the major European, the major Asian banks are reluctant to do more. They're in many cases doing less because they are, quote unquote, de-risking from their international operations. For Iran to continue to take advantage of the JCPOA, and that's critical because those numbers don't lie. Iran is taking advantage of the JCPOA. For Iran to continue to take advantage of the JCPOA, it needs to address some of those business concerns that European and Asian firms have about the climate in Iran. I am convinced that that is possible over the midterm if the JCPOA survives, right? I think it's already really what you're seeing, that those aren't questions and problems that can be resolved in the first 6 months, but I think that the extent of conversation between European firms, European officials, and Iranian partners demonstrates that there is progress along those lines. But it only actually comes to fruition if the platform of the JCPOA survives.
Did you want to add anything?
I mean, there is little I can add, except that for an Iranian, a well-meaning Iranian who wants to do something about the internal, domestic environment, it's very hard to do. And that there are players in Iran which have important economic stakes, business stakes, which don't want the country to comply with the FATF standards. There was an outcry in Iran when Iranian banks started to refuse credit to companies affiliated with the IRGC. I mean, this is what they had to do under, not Iranian banks, but this is what is prohibited under the sanctions, and especially US sanctions. But now there was an Iranian bank unwilling to provide funding to an Iranian company. Why? Because
and the IRGC is not just an Iranian company, it's almost 40% of its economy.
And I don't know how many percent of the political establishment, yes. But I mean, that was because of these voluntary standards set by the Financial Action Task Force. So that's, you can see the difficulties. The deeper you go, European companies wanting to be sure that their business partners aren't affiliated with the IRGC. How can you, as an Iranian business person, reassure your European counterparts that this is not the case? So it's not just that easy. And that's, again, something that one has to take into account, that these business relationships, they will have to evolve. And that we can see good numbers for the first year is great. That this hasn't reached the majority of the population is a problem, and is something which is being fought over openly in the Iranian election process. But it's not easy to achieve.
I think if you look at all this from the Iranian side, you have two observations to make. The first one is exactly what Cornelius was saying, that of course there has been progress, but of course they were expecting much more, and they can very well see when they discuss with their European counterparts, think about all the banking sector, the European banks are telling them very bluntly, as long as we don't have those green lights from Washington, we can't go as far as you would like to. So there is this impression that more should be done, more could be done, and they're pushing for this. And that, talking about what was, I think, the yardstick of Helga, the need to regain trust. Trust has slowly improved, but it's not totally there. That's the first observation. The second one, and there I come back to what was said previously, it's all very well intellectually to say that we should have a sort of firewall between JCPOA and the rest. But seen from the Iranian side, sanctions are still there. You know, the political, let's talk about economic sanctions on one side that have been dropped, but political sanctions are still there.
Because of human rights.
Because of human rights, because of the ballistic missiles, because of support for terrorism, etc. And of course, this is a major issue in terms of Iranian domestic politics. The radicals are just explaining that this is not acceptable, and it shows that the West is still very much against them, very much hostile, and this is feeding an internal debate which is very tough. And if you see more political sanctions being adopted by the Trump administration, this whole debate is gonna fire up again. And this is where we have to be very cautious, because that's a way of slowly recreating distrust, discontent, misunderstanding, which could then have some impact on the JCPOA. The idea that you can just manage to keep it aside from the political debate is something I think we shouldn't be in denial there. The two things are very much interlinked, and we have to be very careful. This is the message, by the way, that Europeans have been pushing in Washington with this new administration. Whether they'll be listened and understood, it's another matter.
But at the same time, some of these countries who are part of the negotiations, including the US, the UK, don't even have an embassy in Iran yet. How can you actually keep on that negotiation, that face-to-face, that rebuilding of confidence and trust, and those pushing the barriers, pushing the limits on, say, the human rights issues, the missile behavior issues?
You have many ways of getting the message through. You have facilitators. American interests are represented at the moment by Switzerland, for instance, and the Swiss diplomacy is very keen to be helpful. You have the Europeans can also get message through, or you have confidential channels where messages can get through. The real difficulty here, of course, is you have on each side, the American side on one side, the Iranian side on the other side, a political situation which is very fragile, very unstable. And of course, any action or any initiative can trigger a reaction on the other side that gets out of control at some point. That's what can happen with Iran. We're witnessing this in this campaign, and we will have to wait for the result. But this presidential campaign shows that the radical wing is still very much there and still fighting very hard.
And many of them are investing on the idea of lack of trust, lack of confidence, not seeing enough from the Western side of the deal or the negotiations, or even wanting to close back, be insular as a country and say we don't need. They call it the resistance economy, as opposed to an open economy that deals with the rest of the world. Jarrett, again, I want to go back to any advice for example, an incoming president on creating that climate of trust and confidence from the Iran end.
Well, I mean, let me say that I agree wholeheartedly with the point that everything about Iran policy needs to be carefully reviewed with the JCPOA in mind. I mean, that's the point that I'm trying to make about this being the single most important thing in the Iran relationship. And so it should be, other issues should be looked at through the perspective of the JCPOA. And I think that that is exactly the kind of explanation that European diplomats are almost uniquely positioned to provide in Washington right now. That level of nuance. And look, we've talked a lot about sort of this side, that side. The fact is that the United States and Europe, we share essentially the same concerns about Iran, right? We have concerns about ballistic missiles. We have concerns about regional behavior. We have concerns about terrorism. To the extent that our European friends and partners can come and say, look, you guys keep wanting to do yet another sanction, but we have a better idea, which is we're going to get at this problem through engagement in this way or that way. I think that that's where Europe can have a really potentially profoundly positive effect in the way that the United States and Iran, the way that the United States approaches Iran over the course of the next couple of years. You know, I think, I do want to say that these European banks, European firms, I think sometimes use the United States as an excuse, right? Because they might not be ready to invest in Iran right now, but they think, well, maybe in a year or two we will be. And why would we sort of put ourselves out there on a limb to explain all of the things that we are concerned about right now when we can just say this is an American problem? The fact is that the remaining American limitations, what we refer to as the primary embargo, what essentially the US persons cannot do business except in very specific circumstances with Iran, it is not that complicated for European and Asian firms to work around those if it's worth it from a profit perspective, right? I mean, it just has to be worth it to sort of find ways to do business outside of the absolutely bog standard ways to do business, and then they can do it.
And evaluate the risk of doing that.
Sorry?
I was going to say,
evaluate the risks.
Jarrett
Right,
is right, but say that to BNP Paribas.
Well, no, I'm sorry, but BNP Paribas is a perfect example. BNP Paribas did not, in good faith, find a way to work around their US nexus. BNP Paribas took information out of transactions and sent them through the United States. Well, of course, that's not a problem with Iran. Actually, most of the transactions weren't Iran-related. That's bank fraud. And I hope that any US administration, any European administration would continue to prosecute bank fraud. But if BNP Paribas wants to do business with Iran by not going through its normal New York correspondence, there's no reason for them not to do so. And so that is not a matter of looking for a green light from Washington. That is a matter of it being worth the business case to do business with Iran. And again, in sort of a broader environment where a lot of these banks are quote unquote de-risking, not just in Iran, but in other high-risk jurisdictions, that's a case, frankly, that Iran and its European commercial partners are going to have to make to the banks to say, this is worth doing because. It is an expense and an inconvenience that is worth absorbing because.
I'm going to mention the naysayers now. There are many in Iran, or Iranians outside of Iran, as well as Saudi Arabia, Israel, some Gulf countries, who are saying you are letting Iran get away with this without abiding by a lot of other standards that they should, and even not trusting the nuclear agreement itself. What is the answer to them? How can you persuade or convince them?
Well, I think the number of the naysayers has shrunk ever since the deal was signed, and it's easy to say no to something what you don't even know whether it will realize or materialize. And once the deal was signed, and now that it's been being implemented for 15 months, 16 months, it's something where people see, okay, there is reason to believe that at least for this very circumscribed area, Iran's civilian nuclear activities. This is something where Iran is abiding by its obligations, as confirmed by the IAEA, the US government, and whoever else is looking at these things. So the response to the naysayers must always be, and I believe naysayers may remain naysayers in public, but in private, they can be convinced that you have to look at what the Iran deal was aiming at, allowing Iran to have transparency in its nuclear civilian program, so that we can be fairly certain that there is no bomb. That's what was the aim, and everything else needs to be negotiated at different levels. And yes, the JCPOA can help by taking one worry off the table, but it doesn't provide a solution to all these other things. Well, some thought with the JCPOA there could be a normalization of Iran's international relations. Others may have thought that Iran would miraculously change its position on Syria, but yeah, well, I mean, we can always hope for these things, but that was never on the table.
In fact, the things that are discussed in the presidential election campaigns in Iran in the last few weeks, if you may have followed, analysts say the question of improvement of Iran-US relations is pretty much not up for discussion. The question of Iran's support for Syrian government or its involvement in other conflicts in the Middle East is not up for discussion. So what do you think will change once we know what the new administration is going to be in Iran in about 3-4 days, maybe?
Honestly, nothing, I think, because they're having the upper hand at the moment in the region. since 2003, if you look at the geopolitical picture of the region, they have managed to get strongholds, very impressive strongholds in Iraq. They're doing the same in Syria, in the Syrian administration, in local governments, all around the areas that they control. They have a strong grip on the Hezbollah. They're starting in Yemen, and maybe they'll go elsewhere afterwards. For them, the last 10 years are all benefits, and this was due largely to Western intervention in 2003, which destabilized the whole region. So if I'm an Iranian leader, even a moderate one like Rouhani, why should I change? It's not fair. I think the pressure is on the Western side and on the Europeans. Precisely when promoting JCPOA, it's to explain to the Saudis, to the Gulf countries, all those that are somewhat frightened by this growing influence coming out of Iran, to explain to them that this is not a reason to get rid of JCPOA for all the reasons that were given beforehand, because from a nuclear proliferation point of view, this is a good agreement. And I think everybody agrees. But then the question becomes, from all the countries in the region, what are you going to do to stop this Iranian influence, and how are you going to act? And this is the question that is put to us. And to be honest, I don't think we have an answer yet.
What about the human rights situation inside Iran, the political openness or lack thereof, and other questions that many ask you, what is being done in those cases? For example, even prisoners in Iran from the US or European citizens who are still in prison in Iran.
Of course, we have I think Helga alluded to that, and there is a human rights dialogue, as we call them, between the Europeans and the Iranians, and interestingly enough, they have agreed, and this is going on. But I don't think that would alleviate the concern or the fear of the Saudis, for instance. What they want is to stop this growing influence. And there, in my opinion, the only way, if we're looking at an answer, is to convince both sides, the Saudis on one side, the Iranians on the other side, to try to talk to each other. So it's about mediating, it's about facilitating the beginning of something that could be a dialogue at some stage. But here again, let's not deny reality. We're very far from this. I think about a few days ago, Mohammed bin Salman, the deputy crown prince, came out with a very strong statement, I'm sure you've seen it, which was everything but friendly towards Iran, and in fact just more or less cutting every possibility of dialogue for the time being. And from the little bit of mediation that Kuwait has tried to exert, nothing much has came out of this. So it's a process that has to start by a way or another. And this is where I think, of course, we could dream and we could hope that the Trump administration would work that way. Let's wait and see how the President Trump's visit in the region will go on, but I doubt he will be a promoter of that kind of dialogue. So I think it's for the Europeans to take the lead on this and to see what they can do, maybe with the support of the Chinese or the Russians if they want to. You have to watch very carefully the relationship between Russia and China. I think there's much to come there, and it would be interesting for the Europeans to watch this. But this is where maybe we could be helpful and positive and constructive.
On a positive and constructive. Do you have anything to add, or shall we open?
I wanted, just before you open, I wanted to say one thing about the Iranian elections, because I do think, depending on the outcome, a number of things will change. And the human rights situation is one that you mentioned. But even for the JCPOA, things would change. I would go as far as saying that the Iranian elections, they are ultimately a referendum on the JCPOA. I have to explain that because, first of all, as Helga Schmid mentioned, all candidates said they are in favor of the JCPOA. So no one wants to scrap the deal. That said, some candidates, and of the few that are left, they would nominally not rip up the deal, but they would do everything they can to make life under the deal difficult, something that President Trump has ended up doing rather than ripping the deal up. So you have to be careful in painting a black and white choice, but ultimately this is about two candidates, the incumbent Rouhani and the conservative Raisi. Funny enough, the field of candidates is whittling down even before the first round. Usually this happens after the first round. So depending on the outcome, the JCPOA may again be in danger. And I'm saying depending on the outcome, A, because there is a lot of dissatisfaction among the Iranian population. So they are dissatisfied with what Rouhani could achieve in office. But ultimately, and that's the reason why I say it's a vote on the JCPOA, he has at least the prospect of, well, not immediate economic improvement, but coming soon immediate economic improvement. Whereas the opposite side is proposing resistance economy, is something that they had voluntarily or involuntarily during the time of the sanctions. So it's still worthwhile watching the results on Friday. I plug in a commercial for what Carnegie colleagues are doing in Washington. They have Karim Sajjadpour. He's working on a poll with Iranians. As difficult as it is to do polling in Iran, they are trying to get close to the results. So that's something that you should definitely watch.
Thank you very much. On this note, shall we open to the floor and open up to questions? If I may, I will ask 2 or 3 questions and then put it to the panel and then come back. Yes?
This is undecided.
Good afternoon. My name is Mohsen. I'm working for EU Reporter. I'm Iranian researcher at Catholic University of Leuven as well. You mentioned FTFD, the International Monetary for Finance of Terrorism. But this deal with Iran is coming to end next month. June is the end of the one-year agreement they have. So what is going to happen after that, keeping in mind reforming Iranian banking system is impossible, as you know, as you mentioned. The most of economy is in the hand of IRGC, and literally they have their own banks. They have their own money laundering system. So there is no way that President Rouhani or no one else can come up clean and renew this deal with the TFTA. So what do you think about that? And also the second question is regarding the human rights situation in Iran. Under the President Rouhani, which you all believe more or less that he's a moderate, we had 966 executions in 2015 only. So don't you think Mr. Raisi is the real face of Iranian regime rather than Rouhani, as the Elliot Abraham he mentioned in his yesterday's article?
Thank you. On this note, can I ask everyone to keep their questions short and sweet? Yes. Is there another microphone? Coming to you.
Thank you very much for the short questions. Mr. Adebahr, you spoke about sanctions, and these sanctions are going to continue because of Iranian terrorism. Do you consider that what Iran is doing in Syria, fighting against ISIS, do you consider it as terrorist activities? Mr. Blanc, you spoke about USA. Do you think that the new administration, well, Mr. Trump, during his campaign, said that he's going to stop this agreement with Iran? Do you think that he's going to be able to do it? And I'd like to ask Mr. Pierre Vimont, do you think that American government, USA government, is going to exert pressures on EU so as to stop this agreement if it's going to happen? And the last question.
Four.
Yeah, it's the fourth one now.
We
but
can
it's very
choose
short,
one.
as you notice. Yeah, and the last question. We speak here a lot about Iran, but a few years ago, when we used to speak about Iran Iran has a nice face. And I noticed that in Europe here, sometimes we consider Iran as a failing state or as a terrorist state, and sometimes it's considered as a, let's say, normal state. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shall we start with the questions on this end on FATF and reforming the banking system?
So on FATF, I think it's a terrific question. It's an incredibly important process. FATF does not have, as far as I understand it, a sort of cut and dry process to move back up through the ranks, right? It's easier to be demoted in FATF than it is to be promoted. What is interesting with FATF came to a fairly unique agreement with Iran last year in order to say, well, if you start to make some progress, then you can move from the blacklist to the blacklist, and they'll need to now, I think, evaluate that progress in June, I believe, is the next sort of decision point, in order to see, is this enough, and what would be next year's plan? My hope is that Iran takes seriously enough the commitments it made in Busan last year, and that it's able to come up with a good plan for next year. Because frankly, if that doesn't happen, right, if Iran were to slip back, I think that the kinds of conversations that we've all been discussing that European banks are having internally will become that much more difficult. I think there was one other question directed to me, which is, will President Trump tear up the deal? Anybody who predicts what President Trump is going to do is trying to sell you something, and I have nothing to sell. What I can tell you is this. If you go through President Trump, then candidate Trump's campaign, and make a list of everything that he said he would do on day one, most of those promises were not things that a president can do on day one. There's a very, very short list of things he could have done, and one of them was to tear up the deal. The way that the JCPOA is constructed, any participant in the deal can walk away from it. He didn't do that. He hasn't done it since. He didn't, in April, Secretary Tillerson certified to the Congress that Iran is in compliance with its obligations. I expect, although I don't have any inside information, that today, at least pending the Iran policy review, the United States will stay in compliance by extending the sanctions waiver package. All of that together makes me say, I don't know what President Trump is going to do, but I know what he has done so far. And so far, the United States has remained in compliance with the deal.
You asked about sanctions, and maybe also the answers should be short and sweet. I can try. No, the terrorist-related sanctions which are in place against Iran have nothing to do with what Iran is doing in Syria. They predate the Syrian conflict, and it's not on this basis that Iran has been the target of terrorist-related sanctions. So that's two separate issues. One can disagree on what Iran is doing in Syria, but that's more a policy and a diplomatic question, and not one which is answered by sanctions.
Can I go back also to the issue of IRGC being an important part of that banking sector or financial sector?
Yes, but it's true. By the way, this is a feature you find in many countries, not the same type, but look at in Egypt and the role that the army is playing in the economy. It's very impressive. So revolutionary guards are not a traditional army in the sense the Egyptians are, but this is a feature you find in many different Middle East countries. And of course, this is a major issue. And it's very difficult for us as Europeans or as Americans to deal with this, because this is revolutionary guard are entrenched in the whole system, the whole regime. And it's not easy from the outside to try to put an end to this, and we have to be realistic on this one. Just to come back to your point, if ever, because I personally don't think he will, but if ever President Trump decided to get rid of the agreement, what would the Europeans do? They would have to stick to it, first of all. As Helga reminded you, it's part now of the Security Council regulation. It has been endorsed by a Security Council resolution, and therefore we all have to abide by it.
In other words, I'm sorry, even if US walks away, it doesn't render the deal null and void. It still sticks.
It will be a totally new situation, and we will have to look what we would have to do. But I don't think you would have the Europeans the day after such a decision deciding that they also will get out of it. They will try to see with the other partners how could we move ahead, and how to rescue as much as we can, for all the very good reasons that were given before. How could we rescue the JCPOA in the best way possible? But once again, if we decide to go along what has been decided by the Security Council, we have to abide by it.
More questions? Yes, please, here, and then back there. 2 here and 1 back there.
Tom Sauer from the University of Antwerp in Belgium about the negotiation format that also Helga Schmid raised. What is really striking is the role of informal diplomatic mechanisms, cooperation amongst crucial states in resolving this crisis. And I mean the EU3 and then the EU3+3. Apparently the formal organizations like the IEA, the UN Security Council and the EU as such, although crucial, needed the setup of these informal mechanisms at a certain point in time. Now, I'm not going to ask you the question whether that's the model for the future, but what is so advantageous of using these informal mechanisms instead of formal international organizations?
Thank you. And you, gentlemen?
Thank you. Mark Bentink, former Dutch diplomat. May we just come back to the role of the naysayers who have been somewhat lumped together in this discussion, and of course they have very different stakes. And one naysayer in particular is, of course, Israel. Israel getting very agitated years ago already, and thereby indirectly perhaps paving the way for this agreement. Could we hear a bit more about Israel? Are we talking to Israel? Are we giving special attention to Israel? Is there a specific role for the US here in particular? I'd be interested in hearing more. Thank you.
Thank you. And 1 in the back, please.
Thank you. I'm Kava Hengeri, the representative of Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan. Well, if we believe that we need an international cooperating against terrorism in the whole world, I think we have the same international cooperating for democracy, secularism, and human rights in the world. And now look to the Iranian regime, the Islamic regime in Iran, is acting brutally in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, and etc. And also inside Iran. My colleague mentioned about Iran, more than 900 people executed inside Iran. What do you think, how the international community, what is the mechanism to put an end of Islamic regime terror machine in the Middle East, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and inside Iran? I think we need the cooperating of international community. We like a secular democratic movement inside of Iran. If you have such a good deal, economic deal with the Islamic regime, and the Islamic regime is in the hand of IRGC, then you are supporting indirectly, at least, the terror machine of Islamic regime of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question is the format of the negotiations, informal versus formal. Who wants to pick this up? Yes.
It has been a very interesting experience, to put it that way, the way we have been going through. It was, I don't know if you can consider it only as formal, because there has been a lot of informal discussion going on at the same time. One of the triangles Cornelius talks about, which is the triangle between the US and Iran, there has been, before the last stages of the JCPOA, there has been a lot of informal contacts organized here and there, track 2 as we say, and this has played its part, and a very important part. So I think what I would say is that this has been a very good example of where you use all the assets you have at your disposal. Formal assets through the international agency, the UN Security Council, this group of countries which came out and decided to do something and then were endorsed by the UN Security Council, or informal through many different tracks and channels. And I think this is a very good example of how to move ahead. And I think the best way to maybe solve the North Korean issue that we're facing, Cornelius alluded to that when he was discussing with Helga, is maybe to take the same spirit, the same mindset, to look at all the assets we have and try to use them, be it formal or informal. I think that should be the way of moving. Maybe just to add an answer to the question about the naysayers, and I think mostly Israel. I think Israel hasn't changed at all with its assessment of the Iranian threat, but I think they have changed the direction of their concern. It's not anymore the nuclear program, because JCPOA seems to stick. It is becoming more and more Syria and Lebanon with Hezbollah. And this is what you're witnessing at the moment. The airstrikes that they're making, the narrative that's coming out more and more in Israeli domestics, that the next danger is, the next threat is at the border with Lebanon and not anymore Gaza. This is where I think now Israel is focusing its mind.
Did you want to add in?
Maybe just on the informal setting, the way the negotiation process came about was very organic, if you like. I mean, the fact that the E3 foreign ministers traveled to Tehran, that was unheard of. I mean, it was only in academic papers that some people wrote about the big three as if this was something very important, or that as if this were some kind of, cooperation format, but it wasn't. And so it started out at this informally, because certain people at a certain time thought it is beneficial to try this route. And it has continued this way. And some things that there was an interplay between, because you also mentioned the IAEA and the UN, there was an interplay between the new negotiation format, which had the buy-in of all the participating states. You had the nuclear and the technical expertise coming from the IAEA as a source of, well, neutral information, as neutral as it gets on these issues. And then you had the UN Security Council for the authority to do something. And ultimately, the UN Security Council tasked the E3+3 to lead these negotiations. The High Representative was formally tasked with finding this compromise. So that makes it, again, a very special case. But without these informal formats, you couldn't have achieved that.
I would just go one half step farther on the question of Israel and point you to a speech that the Israeli Chief of General Staff gave in January of 2016, just a few days after we reached implementation day of the JCPOA. And while I don't have the quote in front of me, essentially what he said was, Iran is no longer an existential threat to Israel. It's a concern. We're concerned about Syria. We're concerned about Lebanon. It's not an existential threat. And I think, again, that goes to, it validates why it was a smart decision for first the E3, and then the E3 plus the EU, and then with the United States and others, to focus on the nuclear program and take that much more serious set of questions off the table so that the other questions could become more manageable.
And can I just direct
Yes.
it towards the other question on
I can come in on that. Yeah, I mean, it's one way to see the JCPOA as indirect, and you were careful in how you were phrasing it, but I understand the reasoning how the JCPOA and the economic benefits support a regime which does a number of things that we wholeheartedly disagree with. But that brings me back to the motivation for the JCPOA. Why is the JCPOA there? So that Iran is not a nuclear threshold power, because that would complicate everything else. Getting to the deal meant this kind of economic improvement of the prospects, the lifting of sanctions, and for all reasons, including the trustworthiness of the negotiation partners, we need to follow up on this. And we see in the election campaign how important it is for the Iranians that the nuclear deal gets implemented. How can one, in the future, within this, hopefully improving set of relations, how can one do more to strengthen civil society? How can one do more to not direct the money which is flowing into Iran into state coffers? That's a question which needs to be asked to, for example, companies, European companies. Do they only want to do the due diligence they are asked to do, or do they want to be more, even more careful in selecting the business partners in Iran? The European Union obviously is trying to engage with civil society actors as part of the softening of relations, as part of the warming of relations with Iran. Again, this is where the JCPOA makes all these things possible. In the period we had before of sanctions and hostility, there was no way to influence developments in Iran for the better. Now we have at least a chance to do so.
Thank you very much. I think we've run out of time. But you can all stay here, as Cornelius mentioned before, over sandwiches, and continue the conversation and the question and answer. Allow me to thank everyone here for their comments, and Madame Schmid, who's already left. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Pooneh.